Alright, so we're going to do a little video here on the worksheet 6. This will review how to name both ionic and molecular compounds. So, I'm going to start right out here. We're going to just fill in whatever is missing. So on this sheet here, the first thing is we've got a sodium ion. Remember, ions always have charges. So if we're writing an ion, we need to have a charge. You can't just put the letter down or the symbol down for the element. So I've got sodium, which has a positive 1 charge, and bromine, which has a negative 1 charge. My charges always have to balance off, so the formula for this is going to be NaBr. The name for this is just going to be the cation, sodium, and the anion, which is bromine, but I'm going to change that ending to IDE, so bromide. Sodium bromide. For my next one, the copper has a positive 1 charge. The sulfate, which is a polyatomic ion, so this whole unit here has a charge of -2. So my copper has a charge of +1. My sulfate has a charge of -2. So I'm going to need to have 2 of these copper ions. So Cu2SO4. And you would name this copper. You'd want to look on, this is a transitional metal, so you need to look on your periodic table or on your polyatomic ion sheet, and then use the Roman numeral to say what the charge is. So this is copper 1, and then the ion was sulfate. Again, you'd need to look that up on your polyatomic ion sheet to see that that is called a sulfate ion. Lead is similar. So this lead, Pb, has got a +2 charge. The chlorine has a -1 charge. So it's going to be Pb. I'm going to need to have 2 of the chlorine ions in order to have enough to balance off the charge. PbCl2. Again, lead is a transitional metal, so I need to look on my polyatomic ion sheet, and you'll see that lead, the charge on the lead is 2, so it's going to be lead 2, and this is going to be chloride. Go ahead and do 4 and 5, and then I'll pause and you guys can check your answers. All right, so here's my answers for 4 and 5. Potassium has a +1 charge. The sulfur has a -2 charge. So I'm going to need 2 of the potassium to balance that off. It becomes potassium sulfide. The tin has a +2 charge. Fluorine has a -2 charge. So I'm going to need 2 of those to balance off the charge on the tin. So it's going to be tin 2 fluoride. For this one here, barium and iodine, I have to use my periodic table to see what is the charge on barium. Barium is in column 2, so barium is going to have a +2 charge. The iodine is in column 17, so all the iodines are going to have a -1 charge. It already tells me I'm going to need 2 of those, so now I'm just going to put it together to name it. So it's going to be barium iodide. So these are the ions. I need to have those charges. I can't just write the letters down with no charge on them. For the next one, aluminum. And I look in the column, and that's in column 13. Everything in column 13 has a +3 charge. And the other ion is chlorine, which has a -1 charge. To name this, it's going to be aluminum chloride. I'm going to pause this and have you do 8 and 9. All right, here's 8 and 9. We've got strontium. You look and find strontium, you'll see that it's in column 2, so it has a +2 charge on it. And for the NO3, we have to look on the back of the periodic table or on your polyatomic ion sheet. You'll see that this is nitrate. which has a -1 charge on it, which makes the name of this compound strontium nitrate. For number 9, potassium is in the first column, so it has a charge of 1. OH is the hydroxide ion. You have to look that up on your periodic table or on your polyatomic ion sheet, and you'll see the name for this is potassium hydroxide. Let's go ahead and do number 10 together. So the first ion I have is NH4. When I look on my polyatomic ion sheet, I see that that's the ammonium ion, and it has a +1 charge. Look on the polyatomic ion sheet and you'll see sulfate, SO4. Each of the sulfate has a -2 charge. You need to be sure that you're writing down the numbers down here when you're writing your polyatomic ions. You can't leave these out. You can't just skip that, and you can't just skip that. The whole ion, which is a unit of 1 sulfur and 4 of the oxygen, is going to have an overall charge of -2. So you can't leave these numbers out that are at the bottom there. All right, so to name this, I'm just going to name it what the 2 ions are, which is ammonium sulfate. All right, I'm going to do this next one, silver oxide, and then I'll have you try a couple of them. Here we have silver, so I have the ion silver, which you look on your periodic table, and you'll see silver is Ag. It's a transition metal, so you look on your polyatomic ion sheet, and you'll see that silver has a charge of +1. And it's oxide. So I'm using just oxygen, and oxygen is in column 16, so that's going to have a -2 charge. So in order to balance these charges out, I'm going to need to have, I've got a -2 charge on oxygen, I'm going to need to have another silver atom in order to balance that out. So the formula is going to be Ag2O, and that would be silver oxide. So I'm going to pause the video. You can go ahead and do 12 and 13. All right, so for 12, it's pretty straightforward. Lithium comes from column 1, so it has a charge of 1. Bromine comes from column 17, so it has a charge of -1. So you put those together, they're already balanced off. It's a 1-to-1 ratio, so LiBr is going to be the formula. For copper, the name copper 2, that 2 tells you what the charge on the copper is, because remember, copper is one of those transition metals. So each copper atom is going to have a +2 charge. The nitrate, each of them have a -1 charge. In order to balance it off, I'm going to need to have 2 of those. So my formula is going to be CuNO3 in parentheses, and then 2 as a subscript. I'm going to go ahead and pause. You go ahead and do 14, 15, and then I'll check it. Okay, again, the manganese 2 chloride tells me that the charge on the manganese is +2. Chlorine always has a charge of -1, so I'm going to need to have 2 of the chlorine ones in order to balance off the charge on manganese, so it'll be MnCl2. For calcium carbonate, calcium always has a +2 charge because it's in column 2. Carbonate, each of those polyatomic ions has a -2 charge, so they balance off in a 1-to-1 ratio. So CaCO3 is going to be the final one there. So I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to finish the rest of the page. You can check that out, and then we'll switch to the back side. All right, here's the rest of the page. We've got 16, 17, 18, 19. 19 was a little bit tricky because sulfur has a -2 charge. Iron, it tells us it's iron 3 sulfide, which means each of those irons have a +3 charge. So in order to get my compound to balance out and be neutral, I'm going to need 3 of the sulfur and 2 of the iron. Chromate is another polyatomic ion, so I have to look on the ion sheet, and I see that chromate CrO4 has a -2 charge, so I'm going to need 2 of the potassium to balance that off. So I'm going to talk through just some naming ones here. Here we have copper. And this time I have to kind of work back and make sure that I know what the charges are on these, because I need to know, because copper is a transition metal, so I have to know which charge to put on it. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with the anion, which is nitrate. I look on my sheet here and I see that nitrate has a charge of -1. There are 2 of them, so my total charge is -2, which must mean that my copper will have a +2 charge because I only have 1 copper, which means to write this, it's going to be copper 2 nitrate. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the next one. I've got chlorine. Actually, this is an easy one because neither of these are, does not have a transitional metal in it. So I don't even have to figure out the charges. This is going to be barium chloride. Here we have mercury. Mercury is a transition metal, so I have to start with the anion side. Oxygen has a -2 charge, so this mercury must have a +2 charge. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. So this is going to be mercury 2 oxide. Again, we're looking at nickel. Nickel is one of those transition metals. The hydroxide, each hydroxide has a -1 charge. I've got 2 of them. So that gives me -2. So I have 1 of the nickel, so that nickel must be a +2. So this is going to be nickel 2 hydroxide. So for sodium, sodium always has a charge. You can look right on your periodic table. It always has a charge of +1. Neither of these actually are transitional metals, so I could just go ahead and name this, but let me just do the charges here. We've got a +3 charge, and if you look on your polyatomic ion sheet, you'll see that phosphate has a -3 charge, so those are balancing off. This will be sodium phosphate. Calcium carbonate. Carbonate is, neither of these are transition metals, so I can just go ahead and name it. Calcium carbonate. Now at this point we've got something a little bit different. We've got 2 nonmetals. Remember, if I have nonmetals, then this is going to be most likely a molecular compound. So to name molecular compounds, I'm just going to name the first element, which is carbon. And then I'm going to use a prefix to say how many of the second element I have. This is carbon di, because I have 2. Sulfide. So I still go ahead and I change the ending to IDE, but you're going to use the prefix to say how many there are. So carbon disulfide would be this one. Looking at this next one, here we have a transition metal. We've got SN, which is our good old friend tin. Tin can have different charges on it, so the first thing I'm going to do is start with the one end with the bromine, and I'm going to find out what is the charge on the bromine. Well, I've got 4 of them, so -1, -1, -1, and -1. That's going to end up adding to a total of -4. I only have 1 tin, so that tin must be a +4. So this is going to be tin 4 bromide. Now I'm looking here at this next one, and I've got 2 polyatomic ions. I've got ammonium and I've got chromate. So all I have to do is say ammonium chromate. Number 10, I've got magnesium and a polyatomic ion, so I can just go ahead and name that one. There's no transition metals. Magnesium nitrate. Lithium's not a transitional metal, and neither is oxygen, so this is going to be lithium oxide. Here we have iron, which is a transition metal. So if it's a transition metal, I have to find out, okay, what is the charge on sulfur? It comes from column 16, so it's got a -2 charge. I have one iron atom, so that must be a +2 charge. So this is going to be iron 2 sulfide. Here we have nitrogen and iodine. These are both nonmetals, so this is a molecular compound. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to name the first element, nitrogen, and I'm going to, because there's 3 of the iodine, it's going to be triiodide. I'm going to name this next one. This is actually technically an acid, but I'm going to name it as if it's a molecular compound. So in this case, I've got hydrogen, which is a nonmetal. All the rest of these are nonmetals. So I'm going to go ahead and name this, and this would be, there's 2 hydrogens, so this is dihydrogen. And then I'm just going to name the polyatomic ion, sulfate. This next one here, potassium, is a metal, so I'm just going to name this using the ionic formula. So potassium has a +2 charge. This is called an oxalate. So this is going to be potassium oxalate. All right, so go ahead and try these, and I'm going to pause this and just give you your answers so you can look at those. Here are the answers for the rest of them. So all of them were ionic except for this one, and this one, and this one. So those are the only ones that were molecular. The rest of them were all ionic. So the main things to check for on these is, first off, check to see first, is it ionic or a molecular compound? If it's ionic, look to see, is one of the ions a polyatomic ion, which means you'll have to look it up, or is one of the ions, the cations, one of those transition metals that you've got to look up to see what the possible positive charges are. And that's the end of that.